You might be thinking that ZBrush for iPad is mostly one of those cool sketching tools, and that doing kind of like a full body character would be a bit of a stretch. So in this video, I'm gonna test that idea properly by essentially building a full body character. It's gonna be a bit more stylized, but it's going to be all done within the ZBrush for iPad app. I'm gonna show you what works, what doesn't, and where kind of like this whole ZBrush for iPad fits in a real workflow. Hey, what's up guys, Pablo Munoz here. In this video, I want to show you how I use the ZBrush for iPad to create a full body character. We're going to start with a quick rough sketch. We're going to add a few accessories, polish all the subtools, and even do a quick polypaint pass. This process would be a little bit long for this video, so I'll speed things up a little bit and walk you through all the steps that I follow, the tools that I prefer to use, and in general, the features that I think are key parts on the process just to get a good result. Okay, so for this character, we're gonna start with a simple sphere. And by the way, I have a custom set of tools and a custom things that I've set up in the pop-up panel that you can set up in ZBrush for iPad. You cannot customize it as much as the ZBrush desktop, but you can definitely put all the tools that you use the most within this pop-up panel, which is very, very handy. So it just makes it easier for me to access the tools and use the ones that I use the most, just put them in there so that I can access them easily. So I just mentioned this because you're gonna see me doing this quite a bit, and that is just a custom palette that I created for myself. Anyway, I love the blocking out technique with a very simple set of primitives. So I'm just gonna start distorting this sphere that I created, and just a tiny bit, doesn't have to be anything crazy, and set it as a low resolution for Dynamesh while I set up the basis of this character. Then I can duplicate this subtool and use this shape to block out different parts of the body, like the head or the neck of this creature. And I don't have anything in mind at this point. I'm just using or letting the shape of this object, even though it's very simple, to kind of like dictate how this creature is kind of like posed or the demeanor of the character in a way. For the legs, you could use something like the ZSpheres or two brushes, or if you're comfortable with things like a Sculptris Pro, you can start pulling things from the main sphere, for instance. But for the sake of consistency, and just because I said that I like to block things out first, I just used a duplicate of that original shape and made it longer and thinner using the Gizmo scale tools. Then holding Control and click and drag, I can duplicate that single piece and rotate it, scale it a bit more, and complete the entirety of the leg. Then all I need to do is mirror and weld it so that I have the two legs. And for something like the arms, is even simpler because I just need to duplicate the legs, adjust the rotation, maybe the scale a little bit, and then just place it in where the arms would be. Finally, I added a sphere for the eye, and I'm going to apply a black color and a toy plastic. I like to use the toy plastic because it has a nice simple reflection, so it just enhances the look and feel of the eye, just kind of like breathes life into it. And I like to have that, or kind of like do this at the beginning so that it generates a little bit of contrast and it stands out from the rest of the sculpt, which at this stage is just a gray sculpture. Now for that kind of like weird thing around the head, I use another sphere. And this is kind of like one of the only times that I use this brush in this sculpt. But the clipping brushes are really good to kind of like slice or remove some section of a simple object like this. So I use the clipping brushes to remove part of this head, and that basically reveals the inside of the head, if you will. And once I have this, because it is ultimately a sphere, I can just duplicate it, scale it down, and I can reuse these as the eyelids. Now, the next step of this process is mainly adjustments. So I use things like the Move brush or the Move topological brush with the AccuCurve enabled. By the way, if you're not familiar with AccuCurve, that is just a simple feature of the brushes that allows you to create a more pointy effect. So it is very prominent and very effective, I think, when you use it with the Move brushes. And the idea here is to create a better flow between those very simple primitives so that they feel that they're integrated or they feel kind of like part of the same and not just a bunch of random single pieces mashed together. Once I was happy with the initial adjustment of the blockout, I moved every single subtool into a folder. I merged that folder, and that produces a new subtool, a single one with all the pieces within the folder. And then I Dynamesh that entire mesh, that entire subtool. And the result is that I have all the parts of that body in a single mesh that I can redynamesh, and I can determine the resolution and all that good stuff. So for this next stage is more about refining the sketch and finding ways to polish that sketch. So I use a combination of a few custom brushes that, by the way, you can find them all within the Pablander Academy resource page. So just go there and look for something like the clean build-up brush, and that's something that I use all the time. is my custom version of the clay builder brush. So I just called it clean builder brush, as in, you know, it does the same thing, but it gives you a cleaner set of strokes. So you can try that as well. The other brush that I use the most is the Gio Brush. This is a brush that is kind of like my improved version of the damp standard brush. I use this all the time because it allows me to create an interesting sort of pinching effect, but it's very, very clean and very simple to use. Also, I try to keep things polished and smooth as I go using the smooth brush. And as I add new volumes, I make sure that I go over and smooth things out. The whole process is really fun, and this is the type of sketching that I love doing in this app. But obviously, to try to move into the more polished territory and, you know, kind of like continue with the idea of this tutorial that is creating the full body character and not just as a sketch, I saved a marker in the undo history, and you can do that from the top right. And then I moved into the ZRemesher. This is basically to create a clean base topology for the entire body. And what's cool about this is that this gives me a very simple and clean topology, a low resolution clean topology. And all I need to do is subdivide this mesh a few times just to generate more points or create more resolution. And then using the project history, which by the way, you can follow exactly the same process in the desktop version, I will project this and recover the work that I did in the Dynamesh sketch. So now that I have a clean base, it's time to start adding some accessories. So I started with the gown or jacket. I don't really know how you call this, but just the piece of clothing that goes over the top of the body. So I do that by duplicating the entire body, removing the lower subdivision levels, and mask the area that I want to create, basically. So when you have the mask, you can use the extract function to create a brand new mesh based on that area that you mask. The cool thing is that the result of this new subtool or the new mesh that you created can be adjusted and can be refined using the ZRemesher and ultimately create a single-sided mesh that essentially conforms to the upper body in my case, or it conforms to whatever volume you extracted it from. So it's really, really handy for things like clothing. The next thing was to make this new piece of fabric feel a little bit more grounded. So I used the dynamic palette to simulate the entire subtool and essentially let it drape over the body. That's it. There's nothing fancy here. I mean, it is a fancy tool and fancy feature, but there's nothing complicated about it. Just simulate it and that's it. And because I have a simple topology, it is rather quick, and you can also use dynamic subdivision to visualize a smooth version of the piece and also give it thickness. Now, for other parts of the creature, like the hands, I like to work on a separate tool, and that separate tool will be a ZSphere. This is really my kind of like go-to feature when I want to create more complex and organic pieces. And by the way, you can use this technique to create antlers or horns or anything that requires more complexity, like a tree branch or things that you need to create some kind of like hierarchy. And to be honest, this ZSphere allows me to quickly create any type of volume. So in this case, just a couple spheres for the hands and set up the fingers. And the cool thing as well is that I can adjust them before creating the mesh. So once you're happy with the ZSphere, you can create an adaptive skin. That's basically moving from this ZSphere feature into a proper mesh. And that's it. You just go back to the working file with the character. And from the append button or for the append option, you bring in that hand or bring the adaptive skin really that you created in a different tool into the working tool. The rest is, more of the same, just placing it and adjusting some body parts to make it feel like that the hands are actually part of the body, even though, they're separate meshes. And that's it. The feet are even simpler just because I went back to the ZSphere tool that I had before for the hands. And because it already had the fingers or the shapes of the fingers, it was a little bit easier to just adjust the placement of the hand to make it feel more like a left foot, let's say. And like I said, the process becomes more repetitive. I just went back to the working file, append the left foot into the working file, and place it right where it should be, adjusting everything else so that, again, it fits part of the same. And obviously to generate the other part of the hands or the feet or anything like that, I just use the mirror and well. So now I can have either the hands or the feet in their own subtool, but you can have both sides in this case. Now, just briefly, I also appended a ring 3D and I placed it around the chest. And I also created the straps around the character using the same extracting technique that I use for the jacket thing. I'm just going to keep calling it jacket for now. So any of the following accessories that I created or any other parts of the model, I'm just going to go a little bit faster because honestly, I already covered the steps and the workflow that I use. So this is just more of the same. Like I said, it's kind of like a rinse and repeat. So using exactly the same tools and techniques, I extracted a few more things and appended other very simple geometries to create any extra accessories like the backpack thing that this character is wearing and that sort of thing. Now, one bit that is worth mentioning are the bandages around the feet. I have a few tutorials covering how to do this in a much more realistic way, so feel free to check those out in the Pablander Academy or the YouTube channel. But I just wanted to show you this because this is a very simple way to get this going. So I just duplicated the body once more and focused on one of the legs. And with the slice curve, which you can access by holding the Control and Shift icons or buttons here, I cut through the model to generate these colored rings. And basically what you're creating at this point are just polygroups, nothing else. You're not actually changing the mesh or anything. You're just slicing through that model, and every time that you slice, it creates a new polygroup in there. Then I hid everything else using the selection tools, except the rings, obviously. And then I use the ZRemesher to simplify the topology based on the polygroups. So now that I have a simple topology for these bands or the rings, I split them into individual meshes with thickness using a single click operation, which is the panel loops function. I also remove the polishing settings so that it doesn't distort the volumes as much. And that's it. Then it's more of the same, just using the move brush to adjust the overall volume and make sure that the bandages actually conform and feel that they're wrapping around the leg and the feet. And then using the move topological, which respects continuity in that topology. That's the reason the rings or the straps are individual pieces, and that helps me create a bit of overlapping between them. So with most of the meshes ready, I started adding some secondary volumes and folds now that I have the pieces where, the extra accessories that were interacting with the actual clothing. So that helps me create or have a sense of where the pinning happens or the compression falls and that sort of thing. So this process is actually quite simple as well. I use the standard brush to create the main volumes, and then the smooth brush to make sure that everything feels, polished as I create those new volumes. And for the more prominent areas, I also use the clean builder brush to really push those volumes a bit more, or at least do it a little bit faster and with more control. But again, is always relying on the smooth brushes to keep it clean. All right, so for the furry bit around the face of this creature guy, I use Sculptris Pro, and this is just for fun. You don't have to use it. You can use any other tool, but I just wanted to show that you can use any tool really the same way that you would use it in ZBrush for desktop. So I started with a custom brush that, by the way, you can find it in the clothes and drapery pack that is part of the resources of the Pablander Academy. It's a premium resource, but you can find it in there. And I use that to generate that sort of initial fur areas of whatever this bit could be around the face, before obviously taking the snake hook brush with Sculptris Pro and push certain bits just to create those more, let's call it the prominent flicks of hair or clumps of hair. So after a few minutes of sculpting bits and pieces and adding some essential details to the accessories, this sculpt was pretty much ready to go. One last thing I decided to add was the beak for the creature. For this, I used a cylinder, and then I relied on the gizmo deformers, so the ones that you can find within the gear icon once you bring in the gizmo, to adjust the taper and the bending of this piece to easily set up the main shape before I, go through the process again that I've done for other pieces, like remeshing it, subdividing it, and obviously sculpting some areas to bring it to the same level of polish as the rest. I think this new piece definitely helps the overall read of the character. It clearly makes the creature more, I would say, defined as a bird creature, kind of like a crow or something like that. And I think that in general, this is a healthy part of the process, that you evaluate your character and how it reads and the proportions and all of that. And if you think something is not working, you just remove it, get rid of it. Or if you think that something is not working quite right, you can bring in another piece and add it afterwards. So these stages of the process and steps that I'm giving you are kind of like the general rule, but obviously if you need to, you can break the rule and then go back after almost everything is done and do a bit of blocking and adjustment for an extra piece. All right, and to wrap up this process, let's go ahead and jump into the color. We're going to be using Polypaint, and I'm going to keep things, very, very simple, just like we did with the sculpt, even simpler, if anything. So the first thing to do is to choose the right brush for the job. So there are already some brushes that you can find in ZBrush that are for this, so like for polypainting. I prefer to just use the standard brush and just go ahead and remove any alpha, so there's no alpha at all, and disable the Z add and enable the RGB. That's it. I also like to adjust the RGB intensity, so you can do that from the slider here on the left-hand side, and this basically gives me more control because I can use the pressure on my pen display. All right, so the polypaint process is very simple. It consists on selecting the object that you want to paint, choosing a base color. This is kind of like setting up your palette, and then you fill that object. That's it. At this point, you can use a variation of that hue, or maybe change the brightness of that hue or the values to create more contrast and highlight some areas in the volume. Honestly, this whole process is the most repetitive one. There's no like a hidden trick or anything. It's just rinse and repeat once again, choosing a new object, filling it with a base color, and then using the standard brush to paint some variations to create that contrast. What I would say about Polypaint is that the hard part is not necessarily the process or the technicality of adding color. As you can see, it's very, very simple. It's more about balancing the right colors and the right values so that it feels harmonious and the whole character, the whole composition feels kind of like unified, and yeah, harmonious is probably the best way to describe what I'm trying to say. So in my case, it was rather simple because I played it safe with some green earthy colors that I think go really well with that sort of brownish tones and yeah, leather colors, and also the black or the dark colors and dark gray colors around the character. I have also a couple of tricks in terms of the composition, or at least if you treat the character as a composition, and those things are the beak, the bones around the belt, and the ring on the chest, because those work really well as accent colors. So I can play a little bit more with the brightness of colors, or even go for more saturated versions of the same colors in here, and that creates a bit of contrast and it helps with the hierarchy of the character. Again, if you treat it as a composition itself. So yeah, that is pretty much it. Here is the full body character created entirely in ZBrush without any pre-made IMM stuff or anything like that. Now, keep in mind that I went for this very stylized character in an effort to keep this video relatively short, but you can definitely spend more time polishing objects and creating more complex things. You can totally introduce things like alphas for high frequency details in your brushes, or things like the surface noise to add texture and surface variation to the clothing. The point of this video is that you can actually produce something very cool all within the ZBrush for iPad app. It comes down to patience and time. If this is the first ZBrush for iPad video you're watching, I would actually recommend starting with my introductory ZBrush for iPad series. I'm gonna leave a link in the description. Also, if you're serious about learning ZBrush for desktop or kind of like from the ground up, check out the Ultimate ZBrush Guide course. This is basically where I teach you absolutely everything that you need to know from a beginner's point of view, so that you know what the basics of ZBrush are, how it works, so you can think about in those terms. And the idea is to actually help you create the things that you want to create. All right, I hope that all of this has been useful, and I'll see you in the next video. Cheers.